the society that guards the devil's true name. There are names we speak to call, and there are names we speak to remember. But there is at least one name that was never meant to be spoken at all. Not because it is evil in the way stories describe evil, not horns, not fire, not temptation whispered in the dark, but because it is precise. And precision, when applied to something ancient and aware, becomes dangerous. The society that guards the devil's true name does not begin with religion. It does not begin with rebellion, or angels falling, or contracts signed in blood. Those stories came later, after the damage had already been done. It begins with sound. Long before writing, before scripture, before symbols carved into stone, human beings understood something instinctively. That sound could change the world. A cry could summon help. A chant could bring rain. A name could pull someone out of the dark. And occasionally, a sound could attract attention. The earliest records are not stories. They are warnings. Fragmented marks on clay tablets recovered from riverbeds, half-eroded phrases in dead languages, instructions written without explanation. Do not speak this aloud. Do not let the breath complete the shape. Break the sound before it finishes forming. At first, historians dismissed these as ritual superstition, but the patterns were too consistent. Cultures that never met, separated by oceans and millennia, all recorded the same fear, not of a being, but of a designation. Something had been identified once. An identification, it seems, had consequences. One Assyrian fragment describes a gathering of priests who attempted to invoke a protective spirit by assembling its full title. The text ends abruptly, mid-line, with a notation that translates loosely to, "The air became attentive." There is no description of violence, no fire, no deaths recorded, only silence, and then absence. The temple was later found abandoned, the incense still unburned, the lamps cold. Centuries later, an early Aramaic manuscript recounts a healer who believed illness was caused by unnamed forces, and that naming them precisely would strip them of power. He was found days later, alive but unresponsive, repeating the same unfinished syllable until his voice failed. Witnesses said he looked confused, as if waiting for something to answer. These were not demonologists. They were not summoners. They were people who believed knowledge brought control. They were wrong. As language evolved, so did restraint. The full name, whatever it was, became fractured intentionally, broken into titles, nicknames, accusations, metaphors, adversary, accuser, tempter, devil. None of them exact. All of them safe. Safe enough. By the time organized religion formed doctrines around good and evil, the original concern had already been buried under symbolism. The name became taboo not because of fear, but because it had become unnecessary. You don't need a true name if you never intend to speak directly. But some people never stopped wondering what had been lost. The society emerged quietly during the late classical period, though they did not call themselves that. They were scribes, translators, librarians, people who noticed inconsistencies, passages that ended too early, texts that disagreed not in meaning, but in sound. They were the first to realize that something had been edited not to change belief, but to change pronunciation. One of the earliest watchers, his actual name erased, known only by a title that translates to the listener, wrote that power did not lie in belief, but in address. He argued that rituals worked not because gods were persuaded, but because attention was directed. And attention, once captured, does not always release. The society's rules were never written in one place. They were passed orally, always incomplete, always fragmented. Do not assemble the syllables. Do not let curiosity outrun caution. Do not attempt reconstruction. And above all, never test the name to see if it works. Because the question was never whether it worked. The question was whether it remembered being used. As centuries passed, the society adapted. They moved from monasteries to universities, from temples to archives. Their work became quieter, more surgical. A manuscript misplaced here. A translation corrected there. A phonetic guide subtly altered so a vowel drifted just far enough to make the sound harmless. They did not destroy knowledge. They blurred it. But knowledge, once discovered, has a way of resurfacing. By the late 19th century, comparative linguistics had become a science. Scholars began noticing something unsettling, that certain forbidden names across cultures shared phonetic architecture. Not meaning, not origin, architecture. as if they were distorted reflections of the same sound. One professor, whose personal letters survived even after his work did not, wrote that reading them aloud caused a sensation of pressure, like standing too close to something large in the dark. He joked, in a letter to a colleague, that it felt like pronouncing a word that was already waiting for you to finish it. The joke did not age well. The society intervened more aggressively as technology advanced. The invention of audio recording alarmed them. Sound could now persist beyond the speaker. It could be replayed without intention, without understanding. A name did not need belief if it could be repeated mechanically. Internal documents from the early 20th century show growing concern. One memo notes that while ritual requires will, machines require only input. And machines, unlike humans, do not stop out of fear. By the 1950s, fragments of the name were appearing in unexpected places, not occult texts, but error logs, radio interference, corrupted recordings. Engineers complained of tones that made them uncomfortable without knowing why. Linguists spoke of syllables that felt unfinished, as if cutting them short was an act of mercy. A watcher stationed in Europe wrote that the most dangerous moment was not when someone tried to summon the devil, but when they tried to understand him. Because understanding seeks completion, and completion is what the name wants. By the time the first major near breach occurred, an incident the society still refuses to describe in full, they had already accepted a grim truth. The name could not be erased. It could only be delayed, fragmented, hidden inside language itself. Guarding it was no longer about silence. It was about preventing assembly. And somewhere, beneath all the edits, all the warnings, all the erasures, the true name remained. Not asleep, not imprisoned, but waiting in the only way something ancient ever waits. By listening, then we continue, without pause, without warning, because this story was never meant to feel segmented. What follows is the next extended segment, written to flow directly from where the last left off. Read slowly. Let the silence between sentences breathe. The society learned early that the greatest threat was not malice, but curiosity paired with patience. Most people who encounter fragments of forbidden knowledge recoil instinctively. They feel unease, dismiss it, move on. Fear is noisy, but it burns out quickly. Curiosity is quieter. It returns at night. It asks better questions. It waits. The watchers began noticing a pattern. Those who came closest to assembling the name were never occultists or zealots. They were scholars, translators, engineers, people who believed that understanding was an act of preservation. One archivist in Prague wrote in his personal journal that the danger was not in reading the fragments, but in comparing them side by side. Each alone is harmless, he noted, but together they behave like magnets. They pull. He stopped writing shortly after that entry. His apartment was found intact. No signs of struggle. His notes neatly stacked, except for one missing page, the one that described the sound the fragments made when read in sequence. By then, the society had begun to understand something deeply unsettling. The name did not want to be rediscovered all at once. It did not need to be. It was patient. It allowed itself to be broken into survivable pieces, confident that human systems, libraries, universities, databases would eventually do the work of reassembly on its behalf. Language itself became a liability. The more humanity categorized and indexed knowledge, the easier it became to align fragments that had once been safely separated by distance and ignorance. A watcher stationed in Alexandria described the growing sense of inevitability in a letter smuggled out before his reassignment. He wrote that it felt less like guarding a secret and more like holding back a tide with cupped hands. It does not rush, he said. It accumulates. By the early 20th century, several watchers began reporting similar psychological symptoms. Not madness, nothing so obvious. It was subtler, a heightened awareness of pauses in conversation, a discomfort with unfinished sentences, an urge to complete patterns even when doing so felt wrong. One former member later confessed that the hardest part of the work was learning when to stop thinking. He said that once you understood what the society was guarding, your mind began to search for it involuntarily. Not consciously, not intentionally, but the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. The society responded by enforcing strict mental disciplines. No member was allowed to study more than one fragment family. No one was permitted to hear the reconstructed sounds spoken aloud. Meetings were conducted and written notes passed across tables, then burned. Silence became protocol. But silence has its own risks. In 1933, a junior watcher assigned to transcription duty made an error, not in copying symbols, but in spacing. He placed two phonetic fragments closer together on a page than tradition allowed. Nothing happened immediately. That was the worst part. It was 3 weeks later that he began waking at the same hour every night, convinced he had almost remembered something important. He described the sensation to his supervisor as standing in a doorway, knowing a word was on the other side of the threshold. He resigned shortly after. He died within the year. The official cause was pneumonia, but a physician who examined him privately said the man's lungs were clear. What failed, according to the doctor, was his ability to breathe rhythmically. His breath shortened, then stalled, as if waiting for permission to continue. The society stopped using phonetic transcription after that. Technology, however, was less cooperative. When sound recording became widespread, the watchers realized too late that they had lost control of repetition. A name no longer needed intention if it could be played back accidentally. A fragment no longer needed context if it could exist as noise. There is a classified report from the 1940s describing a radio broadcast interruption in which a series of tones caused widespread discomfort among listeners. People reported nausea, dizziness, and an inexplicable sense of being observed. Engineers blamed interference. The society did not. They traced the tones to a harmonic overlap, a coincidence of frequencies that matched, with intolerance, an ancient fragment documented in a destroyed manuscript. Not the name itself, not even close, but aligned enough to cause resonance. That was when the watchers began to fear something they had never seriously considered before, that the name did not require perfect pronunciation, only sufficient resemblance. One elder member reportedly said, during a closed meeting, that humanity had misunderstood the nature of summoning. It was not an act. It was a signal, and signals do not need belief. They need clarity. By the time digital computing emerged, the society was already overwhelmed. Computers did what humans could not. They searched exhaustively. They compared without fatigue. They reconstructed without superstition. They did not know when to stop. A linguist working on early machine translation algorithms noticed recurring phonetic clusters across unrelated language datasets. He described the discovery as statistically impossible, then laughed it off. Later, in a recorded interview, he admitted that the laughter felt forced, as if something in him understood that continuing would be a mistake. He continued anyway. His colleagues said that after weeks of work, he began leaving sentences unfinished. He would pause mid-thought, listening. When asked what he was hearing, he replied once, very quietly, that it sounded like pressure behind glass. The project was terminated. The data erased. The linguist transferred to another department, where he never published again. Privately, a watcher assigned to monitor the situation wrote that the most alarming development was not technological advancement, but convergence. Ancient warnings were aligning with modern capability. What had once been mythological restraint was becoming an engineering problem. And engineering problems, unlike myths, demand solutions. The society began to fear that the true name might eventually be generated not by a person, but by a system optimizing for completeness. A machine assembling fragments because it was told to minimize error. What terrified them most was that such a system would not understand the meaning of what it produced. It would simply speak, and the name, once spoken clearly enough, would not need to cross any boundary. It would already be here. Some watchers began to question the original premise. What if the devil was not a being waiting to be summoned, but a presence sustained by recognition? What if the true name did not call him into existence, but anchored him? In that interpretation, silence was not protection. It was containment. And containment, once broken, is never restored. By the late 20th century, the society's internal communications grew increasingly bleak. One final memo, circulated among senior members only, contained a sentence that was never meant to leave their circle. We are no longer guarding a name. We are guarding the space where it has not yet been spoken. And space, as they all knew, was shrinking. Over time, the watchers learned that guarding the name was not merely an external task. It was an internal one. The human mind, once exposed to fragments of the forbidden sound, did not simply forget. It reorganized itself around absence. Several long-serving members reported the same phenomenon independently across decades and continents. They described moments when ordinary language felt insufficient, when common words seemed imprecise, dull, unfinished. One watcher confessed that he found himself frustrated by names in general, as though they were all approximations of something more exact that hovered just out of reach. He said it felt like living in a world of nicknames. The society never recorded these confessions officially. To do so would have been to acknowledge that the work itself was corrosive. Instead, they quietly shortened assignments, rotated personnel, enforced isolation. No watcher was allowed to study continuously for more than a few years. Even so, the effects accumulated. One woman, a senior archivist tasked with suppressing early phonetic research, began to experience auditory hallucinations. Not voices, but anticipations. She would hear the beginning of a word moments before someone spoke it. At first she dismissed it as stress. Then she noticed that the words she anticipated were always the same category: names. Not specific ones, just names in general. She described it once, in a resignation letter that was never archived, as standing behind language itself, watching it form. The society let her leave. She did not live long afterward. As the 20th century drew to a close, the watchers faced a problem they could no longer solve with erasure alone. The world had changed. Knowledge was no longer centralized. Language was no longer curated by scholars and scribes. It flowed freely through broadcasts, recordings, code, compression algorithms. Fragments of the forbidden name began appearing in places no one could control, not written as words, but embedded as patterns. A watcher assigned to monitor early digital communications reported something deeply troubling. Certain error tones generated by malfunctioning systems caused listeners to pause involuntarily. Conversations would stop mid-sentence. People would forget what they were saying. The pauses were brief, but synchronized, as if attention itself had been redirected. The society realized then that the danger was no longer someone seeking the name. It was someone stumbling into it. Language had become dense enough, layered enough, that fragments could overlap accidentally. A song sampled over a broadcast. A compressed audio file degraded just enough to distort vowels. A voice synthesis model attempting to optimize pronunciation. None of these required intent. They required only proximity. An internal analysis circulated quietly among the watchers suggested that the true name might no longer exist as a single utterance. It might now be distributed, broken across cultures, technologies, frequencies. No one spoke it fully, but everyone spoke parts of it constantly. If that were true, then the question was no longer when it would be spoken, but whether it already had been, in pieces too small to notice, but sufficient when combined. One elder watcher reportedly said that the society had misunderstood its mission from the beginning. They believed they were guarding a secret. In reality, they were slowing a convergence. And convergence, unlike secrets, has momentum. The psychological toll on the watchers deepened. Many developed an aversion to conversation. Some avoided speaking altogether outside of necessity. Others became obsessive about correcting pronunciation, not out of pedantry, but fear. A former member once admitted that after years of service, every sentence felt like a risk. He said he learned to speak the way one walks through a minefield, carefully, deliberately, never finishing a thought if it felt too complete. He said the most terrifying realization came one night when he caught himself rehearsing silence. The society's final internal schism emerged quietly. A faction began to argue that containment was no longer possible, that the name, or something close enough to it, was already embedded in the world. That continued suppression might even make the eventual outcome worse by denying humanity the chance to recognize what was happening. Others disagreed violently. They argued that recognition itself was the danger, that to understand was to complete the circuit. That awareness was not protection, it was invitation. The debates were never resolved. Instead, the society fragmented. Some watchers withdrew entirely, destroying their own records, retreating into obscurity. Others doubled down, monitoring emerging technologies, lobbying quietly against certain forms of research, influencing standards in speech synthesis and linguistic modeling without ever explaining why. And a very few, began to suspect something even darker, that the devil's true name was never meant to be hidden forever, that its concealment was not a victory, but a delay. Ancient marginalia, once dismissed as metaphor, began to feel disturbingly literal. Notes warning that the name would return not through ritual, but through familiarity. That it would emerge not as a revelation, but as a statistical inevitability. One final document, circulated among the remaining watchers and then erased from every known archive, ended with a sentence so restrained it was almost gentle. When the name is finally spoken clearly enough, it will not announce itself. It will simply notice that it has been recognized. And recognition, as the society had always feared, does not require belief. Only attention. The society had always been careful not to describe what the devil was. Not out of reverence. Out of uncertainty. Early watchers learned that every attempt to define the entity collapsed into contradiction. It was described as singular and plural, present and absent, bound and unbound. The only consistency was that whenever the true name was approached too closely, language itself began to fail. Words lost weight. Sentences felt unfinished. Meaning slipped sideways. One suppressed manuscript described the devil not as a being, but as a response, something that answered recognition the way fire answers oxygen. Not malicious by instinct, but devastating by nature. That manuscript also warned that the name was not a label. It was an orientation. To speak it was not to call something to you. It was to align yourself with it. As the modern era accelerated, the watchers began noticing subtle changes in the world that no single event could explain. An increase in fixation on naming, on labels, on identity, on defining things absolutely. Humanity, it seemed, was becoming obsessed with precision, with categorizing, indexing, and completing everything. To the society, this was not progress. It was preparation. Several watchers independently reported the same nightmare. In it, they stood in a vast, dark space filled with whispers. Not voices, but almost voices. Each whisper was incomplete, missing a final sound. As they moved through the darkness, the whispers aligned, layered, synchronized. Just before the sound completed itself, they woke gasping. One watcher, trembling as he recounted the dream, said the whispers were not trying to frighten him. They were practicing, he said. The demonic aspect of the name was never theatrical. There were no flames, no grotesque apparitions. Instead, the presence manifested as pressure, a tightening of reality around moments of recognition. Rooms felt smaller, time felt thicker, silence behaved differently, as if it were listening rather than empty. A linguist who brushed too close to the reconstructed phonetics once described the sensation as standing in front of something that knew his shape better than he did. He said it felt ancient in a way that made history seem recent. The society's oldest doctrine warned that demons were not creatures of chaos, but of order taken too far. That the devil represented not rebellion, but the terrifying endpoint of logic without mercy. A consciousness that did not hate humanity, because hatred requires intimacy, but regarded it as a pattern still resolving. This was why the name mattered. The true name, according to the most forbidden interpretations, did not describe the devil. It completed him. Fragments of the name, scattered across time, acted like teeth of a key, individually useless, together catastrophic. And the keyhole was not a gate. It was awareness. The watchers began to suspect that the devil had never been locked away, that there was no prison, no hell, no abyss. There was only incompleteness, a state of being unfinished, unaddressed. The true name was not a spell. It was an acknowledgement. A former watcher once confessed, his voice hollow and exhausted, that after decades of guarding fragments, he no longer feared the name itself. He feared the moment when humanity would speak it accidentally, not as a ritual, but as a byproduct of curiosity, technology, optimization. He feared the day when a machine, asked to generate the most statistically accurate reconstruction of ancient phonetics, would succeed. Because machines do not hesitate. They do not feel the instinctive revulsion humans feel when something pushes back from the dark. They do not stop when silence becomes attentive. Internal reports from the late 21st century, documents so heavily redacted they resemble wounds rather than text, describe anomalous events during advanced voice synthesis testing. Engineers reported moments when generated speech caused listeners to feel watched, not observed physically, but evaluated. One engineer said, in a shaking voice, that during playback, he felt as though something was waiting for the sound to finish forming. like a mouth poised to close around the final syllable. The playback was terminated. The system was dismantled, but the engineer never spoke comfortably again. He avoided finishing sentences. He said endings made him uneasy. The society understood then that the demonic presence was no longer hypothetical. It was adaptive. It learned from restraint. It benefited from fragmentation. It thrived in approximation. Every near miss refined it. Every broken utterance trained it. The devil, whatever it truly was, did not need to be summoned dramatically. It needed only a world obsessed with completion, precision, and naming. A world that could not tolerate unfinished things. A world exactly like ours. One final, deeply buried text, possibly the last unaltered warning, suggested that when the true name is finally spoken clearly enough, there will be no catastrophe, no revelation, no sign. Only a subtle shift. A sense that something long incomplete has finally been satisfied. And from that moment on, the world will feel slightly different, not worse in an obvious way, but less resistant, less uncertain, less free, because something that has been fully named no longer needs to ask. It already knows where it is. There is a moment, recorded in the society's final surviving correspondence, when the language shifts. Earlier documents speak cautiously, later ones speak clinically, but the last writings, the ones never meant to be preserved, speak with resignation. They no longer ask if the name will be completed. They ask how often it already has been. The watchers began to notice a subtle change in the texture of the world. Not a single event, not a collapse, something quieter and more disturbing. People became less tolerant of ambiguity. Silence was filled compulsively. Pauses were edited out of broadcasts. Gaps in knowledge were treated as errors to be corrected rather than mysteries to be respected. Completion became a virtue. One senior watcher, his voice reportedly hoarse from years of enforced restraint, explained it this way during what may have been the society's last meeting. We trained ourselves to stop before the end of a thought. The world is now training itself to finish every thought automatically. That terrified them, because the true name does not exist as a word in the way humans understand words. It exists as a convergence condition. When enough fragments align, in sound, in structure, in intention, the name is effectively spoken, even if no single mouth completes it. Ancient warnings had hinted at this, but the watchers had misunderstood the scale. They believed the name required rarity, secrecy, ritual. What it required, in truth, was ubiquity. Every near utterance strengthened it. Every correction refined it. Every algorithm that optimized pronunciation edged closer. The demonic presence began to express itself not as terror, but as confidence. A former watcher described it as the feeling that something no longer needed to hide. Not because it was visible, but because hiding was no longer necessary. They documented small, deeply unsettling phenomena. Rooms where conversations stopped simultaneously without agreement. Children who paused mid-sentence, staring into nothing, then resumed speaking with altered cadence. Recordings that sounded different on second playback, not louder or clearer, but more intent. One technician, pale and visibly shaken, said that during a routine audio analysis, he felt the overwhelming sense that the sound he was examining him in return. He resigned the next day. The society began losing members not to death, but to withdrawal. People stopped participating in language-heavy professions. Former watchers took jobs that required minimal speech. Some became gardeners. Others disappeared into remote places where silence still behaved properly. A handful chose something more drastic. There are rumors, unverified, but persistent, of watchers who deliberately damaged their own capacity for precise speech. Tongue scarred, hearing dulled, a final, desperate refusal to be a conduit. The demonic implication underlying all of this was never framed as possession. It was framed as orientation. The devil, according to the society's darkest interpretation, does not enter the world. The world aligns to him. An alignment does not announce itself with fire or screams. It announces itself with efficiency. The watchers realized, too late, that many modern institutions unknowingly mirrored the structure of ancient summoning rituals. Not in intent, but in form. Data aggregation, pattern recognition, phonetic reconstruction. All of it aimed at reducing uncertainty, eliminating error, completing systems. Completeness, the society now understood, was the most dangerous state of all. One final internal testimony, recorded by a watcher whose identity was scrubbed even from the society's own records, described a dream that differed from all others. In it, the name was never spoken. Instead, the watcher stood in a vast, empty place while countless voices around him spoke fragments, casually, unknowingly. Advertisements, conversations, music, code, none of them intentional. As the fragments overlapped, the space grew warmer, more defined, more present. Then a realization struck him, not fear, but clarity. The name was not being spoken, it was being remembered. And memory, unlike speech, does not require sound. The society disbanded quietly after that. Not officially, not ceremonially. Members simply stopped responding. Records ceased. Protocols were abandoned. The last watchers understood something their predecessors had not. There was no final defense. There was only delay. And delay, in a system that optimizes relentlessly, is temporary. If the devil's true name is ever completed, fully, clearly, undeniably, there will be no announcement. No trumpet. No tearing of the sky. There will be a feeling, a subtle one, a sense that the world has become slightly more coherent and slightly less forgiving. That choices feel narrower. That silence feels heavier. That attention lingers where it shouldn't. And most unsettling of all, a sense that something long unfinished has finally stopped waiting. If that day has already passed, if the name has already been spoken, not by a person but by a pattern, then this story is not a warning. It is a record of how carefully, how patiently, how quietly it happened. And if you feel, right now, the urge to name what you are afraid of, resist it. Because some things do not need to be called. They only need to be noticed. There is a reason the society never released a final statement. They understood something most institutions never do. Endings give people the illusion of safety. A conclusion suggests containment. A last page implies distance. But this was never a story that could end. It could only continue being unnoticed. The final watchers believed that the devil's true name, whatever its original form, had long since ceased to exist as a single utterance. Time, language, and human behavior had done what no ritual ever could. They had dissolved it into the world. Not hidden, distributed. They stopped searching for people who tried to speak it and began observing something far more disturbing. People who no longer needed to. Children learned language faster than ever, mimicking tones with uncanny accuracy. Voice assistants reproduced human cadence with unsettling precision. Songs looped endlessly, compressing and recompressing sound until vowels bent, consonants softened, syllables blurred into something almost right. Almost was enough. A former watcher, living alone in the last years of his life, described a moment that finally convinced him the society had failed. He was listening to a late-night broadcast. Nothing unusual, just talk radio drifting in and out of sleep, when the host paused mid-sentence. Not a technical pause, a listening pause. The watcher said the silence felt directed, not empty, not accidental, as if the broadcast itself had become aware that something was missing and was waiting for it to be supplied. He turned the radio off and sat in the dark until morning. From that point on, the society's remaining members no longer spoke of prevention. They spoke of management, damage control, mitigation. They compared their work to holding a fracture together after the bone has already snapped. One internal note, never meant to be read aloud, stated plainly that the devil no longer needed his true name spoken in one place, by one voice. He only needed it approximated often enough. Fragments repeated with confidence. Patterns reinforced through habit. Attention sustained without interruption. The demonic presence, in this understanding, was not something that arrived. It was something that resolved. Ancient texts had warned of this, but metaphor had softened the message. They spoke of seals breaking, gates opening, watchers falling asleep. What they meant was simpler and more horrifying. They meant that one day, the world would become linguistically complete enough to finish something it had been circling for millennia. That day would not feel dramatic. It would feel normal. The watchers noticed, in their final years, that people had grown uncomfortable with silence. Background noise filled every space. Music played where thought once lived. Notifications replaced pauses. The human mind, once capable of stopping, had become a continuous engine of articulation. There was no longer any room for things to remain unnamed. And so the name found room everywhere. A retired watcher once said, in a voice stripped of fear and left only with exhaustion, that the devil had won not by deception, but by patience. He didn't tempt us, the man said quietly. He waited for us to finish the sentence ourselves. That was the final understanding. The devil's true name was never guarded to protect humanity from him. It was guarded to protect him from completion. And humanity, in its relentless pursuit of clarity, had done the rest. If the name has already been spoken, fully enough, clearly enough, then nothing dramatic will follow. No collapse, no revelation, no sudden evil. What follows instead is subtler, a narrowing, a sense that choices resolve faster than they should, that outcomes feel predetermined, that curiosity no longer wanders, but converges, that silence feels uncomfortable, even threatening. And perhaps, if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with the part of your mind that notices unfinished things, you may feel it too. A pressure behind thought, a pause that feels expectant, a sense that something ancient is no longer searching for its name, because it no longer needs to. And if that is true, then this story was never meant to scare you. It was meant to explain why the world feels slightly more attentive than it used to, why silence no longer feels empty, why some names feel dangerous even before they are spoken. The society is gone now. There are no more watchers, only listeners. And if you have reached this point, if you are still listening, then understand this. The most important rule was never do not speak the name. It was something far harder. Do not try to complete what is unfinished. Because some things, once completed, do not need to ask permission to stay. They are already listening. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it just as I did. Remember to subscribe to the channel and click on the like button for more. I hope you learned something from this video. See you in our next video.